Okay, so the way this is going to work, we're taking an app, the LTI starter app from Atomic Jolt, and we're going to be extracting the module that deals with the Canvas API, interfaces with the Canvas API. We're going to take that out and turn it into a gem. In order for this to work, if you wanted to follow along, you need to have the LTI starter app checked out and configured so that it can actually, you can run the Rails console in it. So if we're in here, you should be able to do in Rails and pull that up. That's the bare minimum to get to do this so that we can test it all when it's done. Second of all, you need to know what you're going to call your gem. There's a lot of pros and cons here. As this is the Canvas API, it makes sense just to call it Canvas. But having a gem called Canvas, Canvas is kind of a generic name. There's the risk of namespace conflicts. Best practice is to have a gem called Atomic Jolt Canvas. Let me pull up something here. I can give you some examples. So Canvas, a gem called Canvas, you would say require Canvas, and that would pull it in. But if someone else had a gem called Canvas already, that did graphics, for instance, that could be an issue. Ideally, you'd have something called Atomic Jolt Canvas, which would load. It's going to try and look for, sorry, actually what I meant to say, atomic_jolt hyphen canvas. Ruby gems will try and look for a directory in a gem called atomic_jolt/canvas.rb, and we'll automatically try and load that if you want to go that route. For this though, we're just going to go simple and go with Canvas. But there's a whole bunch of conventions when it comes to Ruby gems as far as what you're naming things and how they map. And this is going to be the safest way in the long term, but it would require a lot of refactoring in the app to make that fit. So we're just going to go with Canvas. Next step, we need to decide if we're going to go with a vanilla Ruby gem, or if we're going to go with a Rails gem, or we're going to go with a Rails engine. The differences are, if you have a vanilla gem, that's really easy to create because you just have a directory. You just make a directory. It has, so if we have a Canvas directory, we would have a lib directory under it, and we'd have our specs, and that's really all you need. You would have a canvas.gemspec file in it as well, which is going to be the metadata for your gem. Really, you're given a lot of flexibility when it's a vanilla gem. You can structure it however you want, but you kind of have to do it all yourself. For a Rails plugin /gem, this is also a vanilla gem, but it has Rails opinions behind it. To create one of these, you use the Rails app, and you say Rails plugin new, and then Canvas. And that will create a directory, pre-populate it with subdirectories and all the things you need. This is nice because you don't have to remember the format of the gemspec file, but again, you're getting the Rails opinions. The third option is a Rails engine. There's actually two flavors of Rails engine. The thing about a Rails engine is it's actually a mini Rails application that you're pulling into your app. So this is like if you had a forum or a wiki or some other big component that you wanted to drop in and mount at some place in your app. To do a Rails engine, you do Rails plugin new /full. And that would then create, an empty application skeleton. It would create an engine, which is like like in a Rails app, you have the application object, which subclasses engine. So when you're doing one of these, you actually have an engine that you can configure just like an application. And then when Rails loads this, it automatically executes that engine and does all the configuration for you. There's also Rails plugin new mountable. The difference here is that this is going to share the namespace of your application. This is going to have an isolated namespace. So you have a user object in this one. It's not going to clobber a user object in your app. But this, you have to make sure you're not stepping on each other's namespace. The same goes for routes. With these, you actually say in your routes where you want your application to exist, and it will mount under that. This one just uses the existing routes of the host application. These tend to be very complicated. I'm not a fan of doing engines for any except really edge cases where you have a lot of control, where you have a full application that you want to share. In our case, we don't have a full application. We could theoretically extract a few controllers to use, but there's easier ways to even share controllers between gems. We're not going to worry about that right now. So I'm going to go ahead.
Devise is an engine. Right?
Yes, Devise is an engine. Devise is done as an engine, and even then, I question whether it needs to be an engine, but it is. We're going to go with this for a few reasons, primarily because it's faster, because we can just get started right away. So to do that, we just say Rails plugin new canvas, and bam. A few things to note here. It gives you a README, a rake file, gives you a pre-generated gem spec file. It assumes you're using an MIT license, gives you a gem file for development. This gem file is only used for your development stuff. And then it's got all the files that you need. It assumes you're using the test framework that Ruby comes with. We'll switch it to use specs. And then it also generates this dummy vendor app. This is so that you can build tests that actually run against a Rails application. We're not going to worry about that because this canvas gem is actually closer to just a vanilla Ruby gem. It doesn't depend on a lot of Rails stuff. So there's what we got there. So to begin, what we're looking to refactor here is in the starter app under lib. We have this canvas RB and canvas urls.rb. Canvas RB contains the code that basically encapsulates, abstracts the Canvas API. Canvas URLs is a bunch of static data that describes the URLs that the Canvas API uses. We're going to move those from the LTI starter app to Canvas, to our Canvas gem. Sorry, LTI lib canvas. And we're going to throw that over here in lib. Now, actually, let's open this, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my own opinions. Right now, we just have a class canvas, and then in here we've got all the API code for it. I'm going to recommend that we actually have a module canvas and a class API under there. The reason for that is that now we have a canvas namespace for anything else that we want to put in this gem, like the URLs, any supporting classes, modules, and so forth. It's nice to have, if you're going to do a gem, it's nice to not pollute the namespace of whoever uses it. Minimize the number of top-level constants. If you were doing the atomic jolt idea, you would put another module around all of that as well, but for the sake of simplicity, will not. So we'll do the same sort of thing with canvas URLs. Indent all of that. Did I mention this is a big file? There it goes. Okay. Now, one thing to note about this, refactoring-wise, is you have a method here that returns a constant. Right? This hash doesn't change. It's always going to return the same hash every time you call this. Also, I'm going to recommend we do that. Instead of canvas URLs, you just have canvas URLs. So instead of having a class that wraps a method that returns a constant and does nothing else, we could just say canvas Vim doesn't like big files like this, apparently. I think it's just a lot of syntax highlighting that's getting tripped up on. So now we can say canvas URL and grab each of those individually. So instead of saying canvas URLs, whatever, we can get rid of that bit in the middle. Man, it really doesn't like this file. So it's a little simpler, a little easier to read. And we don't need that in. Okay. Now, because we've got the Canvas module, let's move these things. First of all, let's move Canvas RB under the Canvas directory, and we'll call it api.rb. And likewise, we'll move the Canvas URLs to Canvas URLs.rb. There's also, this is the other thing the Rails plugin new does for you. It creates a version RB file for you, which just lets you specify a version. Personally, my personal preference is that you don't ever release a 0.0.1 version of anything. If you're releasing it, it's version 1, right? It's the first version of something you've done. So that's my strong opinion. Okay, so from there, we need to do some more refactoring. So let's open the API, and down here, there's these constants, these exceptions that are being used. Another good practice is to have a single exception that inherits from, runtime error. And then all of your class's exceptions will then inherit from that. So this way you can rescue Canvas API exception, right? And that will cover anything that your plugin throws. And runtime error is a good idea. I don't know if you know the difference. Like if someone does this, like what does rescue catch? If I were to raise exception, that rescue is not going to catch it. The rescue without an explicit class type will only catch runtime error descendants. I don't recommend using a rescue without specifying what you're trying to rescue, but in general, if you're doing a custom exception in your class, I recommend subclassing runtime error. And then another thing you could do is you could actually take these exceptions and throw them into their own file, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Okay, let me check my notes here. Okay, so now what we need to do, this Canvas refresh token required becomes Canvas API, right? So we just need to go through and fix all of these because refactoring breaks things. Okay, and then I think there was an instance of, Canvas URL type becomes Canvas API URL type, okay? This Canvas URLs, we break that too. Oops, not that one though. Like that. There. Okay. One thing I noticed too, this ignore params does not seem to be used anywhere. And even searching in the app itself, it doesn't seem to turn up. So when you're refactoring something like this, it's a good opportunity for it to find constants. Constants often get orphaned, and so it's a good chance to double check what you're using and where you're using it. One other thing I've noticed, refactoring wise, are these methods that are prefixed with API underscore. If you have Canvas, if you've instantiated an API instance and you call it API and you're doing API.API put request, it just reads kind of weird. So, you can refactor those. I'm not going to worry with it right now, but refactor the API underscore out of that, or even just call it API put and API get and API post. There's pros and cons, but a smaller API is less error prone. Okay. One thing we need to do with this now is because we're referencing that Canvas URLs object, we need to require that. Rails can kind of make you sloppy. You don't think about the dependencies between files so much. You don't have to require things yourself very often. But because we're now looking at making this less dependent on Rails, we need to go in and explicitly require the files that we want. And one other thing, now that we're in here, Actually, what directory are we in? Okay, we're in lib. So we're going to create a canvas RB file in lib, which is going to require canvas API. Actually, it's going to define the canvas module first, and then it's going to require canvas API. And canvas API requires canvas URLs, and so with one, you get it all. Now, the reason we have a canvas RB in the lib root is because that's what RubyGems is going to load when you say require canvas. It's going to come in and look in the canvas gem for a file called canvas RB in lib. And so this is where you can say require canvas, and it will load whatever you want to auto load in your gem. Now we need to take a look at the gem spec. See here, Rails assumes you're going to have a canvas version, and it uses it right there to specify the version of your gem. Ruby gems will all automatically look in your Ruby gem config. I think it's .gem / something. Could be wrong about that. But in this case, I'm not the author. I'm going to put Justin in here so that I can blame him. And I don't know Justin's email.
Oh, that's good.
Email. Now the thing you need to remember, see it fills in a bunch of to-do stuff here. If we were to try to build this gem right now, gem would cry. It would say, you cannot have a description that contains to-do or fix me. So it basically forces you to put something in here. So you need to have a URL, which can be just a GitHub page or whatever you want. A summary and a description. The difference is kind of subtle in my experience. I rarely want to write like 3 paragraphs about my gem, so I usually have these saying the same thing. So for now, we'll just take the to-do out. And then your license. You should spend some time thinking about what license you want. Rails likes the MIT license. I'm going to leave it that way for now. But if you decide to change it, you need to change it right there and right here. And then you need to change the actual file that contains your license. By default, it puts this dependency in, which is remarkably specific. Probably better, unless you have a really compelling reason to go that specific, just have it depend on like 4.2. Okay. And that's right. Rails plugin also likes to put your name on the license. And there's always these little tiny places you have to remember. Okay, so now theoretically, that's all we would need to do to get that basic stuff over. Obviously, we haven't moved the tests. We don't even know if this works yet, so we still have more work to do. But if we wanted to build this gem right now, another nice thing about Rails plugin new is it gives you a rake file that installs the bundler gem helper tasks. So you can do rake -t, and you get rake build, rake install, rake release. If I do rake build right now, bam, it creates a gem right there. Using, see, it gives you version 1.0 because it pulled it from that version. You can also do it with gem build and then give it the gem spec file. Gets a little noisier, right? It says, oh, you're using, in our case, we didn't actually specify a version. So it's saying, if you don't want a version, be explicit about that. So those gem tasks in the rake file are just conveniences around that gem.
And that's
gem
given
command
to you because it was generated by Rails.
Exactly.
Because we used to, a long time ago, use Jeweler to build gems, and so we would depend on those rake tasks. So I don't think Jeweler's been maintained in years.
Yeah, I think gem is now
Gem's
the de facto. So yeah, the Rails plugin new, like everything in Rails, does a lot of magic for you, but it's not magic. The stuff is there in the rake file. It just pulled it in for you.
Well, and here I noticed too that you've removed the vendor dummy application.
I haven't yet, but I will.
Oh, is it?
It's under here.
Oh, there's okay. I was thinking that it was
Yeah. So you see, test dummy is a full Rails app.
Right. But if we remove that, then we can also remove the dependency in the gem spec to say we don't actually need Rails, right? Like at that point, you're not dependent on Rails even in development.
Exactly. We'll see that we do have a slight dependency on some of Rails, the active support stuff with blank and present, and some of those will need some dependency on active support. But
so is it a good idea to be specific and say we only need active support, or do you still want to say
yeah,
Rails?
it is a good idea just to say what you need for the sake of documentation, so people looking at the gem know what to expect, but also just so you don't pull in the world when all you need is a couple of methods. So I'm just going to blow away this test directory because we don't need it. We've got specs already written in the other app for this gem. Blow that away, and we're just going to create LTI. We're going to make a specter, and we're going to move from the spec directory this, no, it's under lib, canvas lib, canvas spec. We're going to move that to our spec. Okay, checking my notes here quick. So yeah, if we now look in that, first of all, it requires a Rails helper, which we don't have anymore, and we don't need all of that, so we're going to get rid of it. And now we can start having some fun. This is where it starts going iteratively. We can try running RSpec. Uh-oh, right off the bat we get an uninitialized constant, canvas, right there. Well, it's because Rails helper does some magic for you and automatically requires the files you need. So we're just going to require canvas. We try it again. The world is very unhappy with us. I don't think we'll have time to go over the full process of fixing everything, but for instance, there's some things I wanted to point out. So let's do that. Uninitialized constants, factory girl. Now, we don't have a database in this gem. We don't have any active record stuff. We have nothing. Factory girl doesn't make sense. So really what we ought to do is just get rid of that and replace it with an open struct that kind of represents what we need. So we can pull in that provider, the token, and the provider URL. To do that, we also need to require ostruct, and then we can try it again. Except we added a line, so 24. Undefined method new for canvas module, because it's no longer canvas.new, right? So if we come in and we look for canvas.new, well, now that's canvas API. We do that everywhere it shows up. Making progress. We've got another dependency. This is kind of a sticky one. URL helper is a helper defined in the LTI starter app that does some URL manipulation for you. We need to make a decision because in the Canvas RB, Canvas API, sorry, one of the very first things it does is say, okay, we need to normalize this URL. You can either pull in URL helper and make it part of this gem, which I don't recommend because it's not really related. You can make URL helper its own gem and depend on it, but that's kind of overkill for what we're doing. You could extract scheme host and duplicate it in the Canvas API. I mean, that's a possibility. Or what I would recommend is actually just take it out. And now the dependency, now the requirement is that whoever instantiates a Canvas API instance needs to make sure that the URL is a URL, that it's normalized and maybe passes through that scheme host. But I mean, that's the simplest solution, and it minimizes the dependencies and duplicated code. And now here's where we're getting to the Rails stuff, right? Now it's saying, okay, we need present. Well, excuse me. I'm going to cheat and look in my Canvas ref for the sake of time. Canvas API. Here's what you can do. You can actually require just what you need of active support, because active support is monolithic. It's huge. So first you say require active support, which pulls in the basic framework for active support. And then we're going to say we want to pull in object blank, which includes present. You'll see that we also depend on like turning a hash into a query string. We need some the Rails extensions for hash keys. So we're just going to take this, throw that all up there, just to fix all of that. Here's another one, LTI config, which is a dependency the LTI starter app provides. And this is just in the tests. So LTI config. Right up here in the setup, it tries to pull some config out for that. But the thing to remember is that these tests are all mocked. It's never going to hit an actual server. So we can just do that. We don't care what the config XML is. We just need the tests to work. So bam, we've eliminated another dependency. Oh, look at that. Isn't that beautiful? It passes. It's warning us about some duplication in the URLs file. I'm not going to worry about that right now. Looks like there's a couple keys that are duplicated, but we're good. There's a few other things that we need to keep in mind. And if we look, at the, I'm going to cheat again and look in my spec over here. We need some support files. HTTP party has some configuration so that it'll mock the calls and not make actual HTTP calls. And then we need some web mocks to stub out the actual calls we're going to use. So we're going to create CD maker. That's awesome. We're going to make a support directory here, and then we're going to copy from my canvas ref spec support to there. Nope, not to there. Move HTTP party and webmocks to support. Okay. And then in our spec, we're going to require those things. Support HTTP party and support webmocks. Now these were both pulled from the LTI app. So if we look at this one, it's just these helpers to make HTTP requests and to parse the response. At this point now, okay, close. Okay. Canvas URL. Okay. So this is the other part now, because we moved those specs over. Canvas spec. Oops. Canvas dot. That's Canvas API. Okay, but you see, this is the process, right? We go through it over and over. You see one that fails, you copy it out, you run it, see what the actual error is. Uninitialized constant. Well, it's because it's not Canvas invalid refresh options, it's Canvas API. So let me just change this one. No, I'm not. It's going to take too long to search through those. But eventually, we will get all of these to pass. And then life will be happy, and we'll be able to move on to the next part. I actually documented all of the things that I had to fix. But we're not going to do that. The next step now that we have this theoretically working, is we need to fix the LTI starter app so that it's okay with the gem. This is one way that we can verify that our gem is working. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open the gem file, for LTI starter app. And we haven't deployed our gem anywhere. It's just sitting on our computer in a directory. So we're just going to say gem canvas is at canvas. That path means it's on my local machine and it's located at that place. And if we bundle it now, you'll see using canvas 100 from source at canvas. So theoretically, we can come in now and say canvas URLs keys first. So it's there. We've got it. It loaded up just fine. Okay, so as we're doing this, we should make sure that we're cleaning up the code that we no longer need. Like we should make sure we don't have our Canvas RB in the LTI starter app. We've been moving those out, moving the spec, moving the support files that it doesn't need anymore. Oh, there was one other thing that I need to, that's what it was. I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in here, there was one other tricky kind of leaky concern that was occurring. If you look in Canvas RB, I'm sorry, Canvas API, there's an authentication, a reference to this authentication model. When you refreshably do something, it's going to check to see if it needs, like if refresh token required was raised, and if it was, it's going to do a transaction on authentication, get the lock, get a new token from this refresh token method and save it, and then retry it. Well, this authentication model exists in the app, not in the gem. So what do? A pattern I like is when you see this, allow it to be configurable. Put the responsibility of saying what to do in this situation on the client app. So instead of putting this code right here, we're going to add an API, call it onAuth, and that's going to take a block. And then we just say onAuth equals that block. And will give us a default. It's going to take one argument, which is the API object itself, and it needs to return an authentication object. Well, we have an authentication object when we initialize right there. So let's expose that so that our default can just return that authentication object. That is obviously not going to fly for real life, but it allows us to assume that there's always going to be an auth block there. Okay, so now we can come down here and we can actually...
So really quick, go back to that.
Yep.
So you've got it set up so that you have a default block, which is just return the existing authentication, which, you know, like I said, wouldn't work in the real world, but it allows us to always safely assume that there's something there so that the app doesn't crash.
Right, and it simplifies your code later, because now I can always know that onAuth is going to be a valid block. Right, down here I can just say authentication equals onAuth call self, okay? And all of this then gets moved to the client app. I don't need to check to see if onAuth is defined and then have some default behavior if it isn't, like raising an exception. I just assume it's there. Another option is instead of returning the authentication object, you could raise an exception, right, as the default behavior. It's good to have a default so you can eliminate edge cases down the road.
And your exception could be like add on a callback.
Exactly. API not configured or something, right? Okay, so that was that. So one of the things we need to do now here in the LTI starter app is we need to add an initializer. Config initializers. There's a bunch of things in here that the app uses to configure different dependencies. Devise, you'll notice, is enormous because there's a billion options you can do on that. We don't need anything fancy. I'm going to cheat again and pull from my reference. Canvas API. And this, actually let me open it. It just does that, Canvas API onAuth, and then that block. The other thing, actually there was one other thing. There's always one other thing. In here, in the API, down where we used this, right below it, there's this get authentication lock. This again has nothing really to do with the canvas itself, it's more application specific. You'll see when I refactored this, I just dropped that in directly. Since that was the only place it occurred, we get the lock, we tap it, call it authentication, and do what we need. And then tap, of course, makes sure that the return value of the transaction is that new authentication object. So we can just come in here, we can get rid of that too. I left the refresh token method here in the gem, because that is related to the Canvas API. And it can be used over here because we passed the API to the on-off method. Here we can say API.refresh token. Here we can reference the existing authentication object to see if the token is the same as what we're pulling out of the database, right? So by exposing those APIs right there, we were able to add some configuration so the app itself can define its behavior in that situation. Okay. So the next thing to do is to go through, and we won't do this necessarily, but in the LTI starter app, is to look for Canvas, specifically Canvas dot. We would need to go through and change all these to Canvas :API or :API. Look for references to the existing exception classes so that they can be refactored. This is just legwork, tedious, but not hard, right? And once you've gone through and done all that, you should be able to come into the LTI starter app and say, this is probably not going to work. You should be able to run RSpec and have it pass, but this is going to be referencing the other, well, that one's going to time out because I don't have the capybara or whatever it is that you have installed. There. And it works.
Nice.
Applause, right? Yay! So RSpec works. We're not done. This gem also has some rake files, rake tasks. Now they are rake tasks that aren't exposed to the client app. The client app doesn't ever need to do them, but they're used to automatically generate the API. And so what you can do, I'm just going to have us look at my Canvas gem. I'll show you, first of all, in the LTI, where am I? In here, under lib tasks, there's a Canvas API rake. Okay. With one task right there, which scrapes the Canvas API and depends on that code to do the scraping and the formatting and all that. We're going to pull that over. If you look in the Canvas gem, once it's pulled over in lib tasks, it's basically lib. It's right there. I neglected to pull over under lib tasks Canvas API. That directory should also come over because that's all of the templates it uses. But now that's there, called .rake. To make sure we can actually use that in our rake file. Oh, it's because I'm sorry. I was thinking I was in this one. Okay, in our rake file. Whoa, my goodness. I'll just cat it. Right here. We load that into our rake file, and then those rake tasks, that rake task is now available as rake Canvas API. You'd obviously need to go through those rake tasks and make sure that the files they generate are getting put in the right places and so on and so forth. But again, that's just legwork. Once we've got all this, we can build the gem using rake build.
Let me pause and just ask you a real quick question. Typically when you're building a gem, if you're going to put the rake tasks inside the gem, is it good practice to namespace based on the name of the gem?
Oh yes, thank you for mentioning that. Absolutely. It's not going to like it if I try and... delete it. So yes, right here, namespace canvas. It's less important for a rake task that you're only going to use in that gem as part of the development process. But if you're going to expose this to other clients, then yeah, it's definitely a good idea to keep the namespace clean. Because in this case, it's just called API. It's conceivable that someone else might have an API task that does something else, and then you'd be fighting over it. If you wanted, this is where it gets kind of ugly. If you wanted to be able to expose these rake tasks to a client and you're not using a Rails engine, if you're doing a Rails engine, Rails will automatically find the rake tasks and load them up for you. So that's another benefit of using an engine. But if you're not using an engine, you basically have to do along the lines of, and I'm not going to be able to do this exactly off the top of my head, but I'll give you the idea. First, you need to figure out where the gem is, and so you do something like gem specification, find by name, or something, canvas, and then you load gem path to thing / libtasks canvas api.rake. So it's ugly. There's ways to get around that, I'm sure, but that's kind of the accepted way to expose a task to someone is just tell them to put that in their rake file.
So you probably drop that in your own documentation, say copy paste this.
Exactly. And I'm sure if you were to look around, you'd see lots of creative ways that people have come up with to get around that. Like I said, if it's important that these are available, you might consider making a basic engine just so you can have the engine file load and have Rails take care of all that for you. But yeah, once you're done with that, rake builds your gem for you. And then if you want to push it to RubyGems, you need an account to rubygems.org. You need an account on rubygems.org. And then you can just say rake release. And I won't do that because I would become the owner of the gem. But what it will do, the first time you run rake release, it'll ask you for your credentials on rubygems.org. And it'll then push that gem up with you as the owner. If you want multiple people to own it, gem owner, I think, is your friend. Yeah, gem owner add -e -a. Gem owner -a.
Doesn't that add it to the gem spec for you?
No, gem owner -a, I think actually pushes, like adds that person on RubyGems as an owner of the gem so that they can push. So yeah, you'd also want to change the gem spec, you know, adding author, another author there, and another email. But as far as owners able to release gems, that's how you do it, gem owner -a. And that's the process. So any questions?
Awesome. That was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
Thank you. And now I just need to figure out how to